I didn't have any money to buy a new vanity. For the past year, I have been working on remodeling this bathroom pretty much on my own. I had no idea how much this bathroom remodel was going to cost. And as I was nearing the finish line, I realized I didn't have that much money left in my budget. So I challenged myself. I said, listen, you've got nice tools, you've got the skills, you've got leftover material from previous projects that you could probably use. You can flip this vanity and save yourself the money. And so that's what I did. So today I'm going to show you how I took this 20-year-old vanity and transformed it from this basic builder grade vanity into this. So let's go. First thing I did was remove the cabinet doors. And as I was removing the doors, I realized these cabinets are actually shaker style cabinets on the inside. I thought to myself, if I cut off the edges, flip the doors, maybe I could make them inset cabinet doors and save myself the trouble of building brand new doors. I figured it was worth a try. The next day, I worked on removing the drawer fronts. As you can tell, this longer drawer front is not really a true drawer. It's attached with screws on the inside, so I had to remove those first. On the outside, the edges are caulked, so I scored the edges with a utility knife to make it easier to remove the drawer front. For that task, I used a self-prying bar and a small hammer until the drawer front was loose enough to pull it off. This cabinet was actually one of the first DIYs I painted in this house. I decided to use a furniture stripper to help remove the 4 layers of paint on this cabinet rather than adding a few more layers of paint on it. I used a paint stripper that was supposedly magic, except no magic was happening here. I was pretty disappointed and decided to just use a large scraper instead. I scraped my little heart away for 20 minutes. It was a lot of work, but it was also a necessary evil if I wanted this vanity to look good. So I got it done, and I also got a really good workout out of it. Once I scraped through the 4 layers of paint, I sanded. This was a much easier process, and it went a lot quicker because I have a nice sander hooked up to dust extraction. So here's a tip. You don't need a fancy sander to do any DIY, but if you plan on doing more DIY, especially planning on doing furniture flips, having a good sander makes a huge difference, especially when hooked up to a dust extractor. It's definitely an investment, but I can tell you it is worth every single penny. Sanding is such a breeze, and I don't have to worry about leaving a huge mess. The dust extractor does what it's supposed to do. It's great. I highly recommend it. Sanding took another 20 minutes, but it didn't seem as long because I was letting the sander do most of the work. Anyway, once I sanded most of the paint off, I cleaned everything up and vacuumed the vanity to prepare it for painting. I found this remnant piece of quartz I really liked at a local stone place. I've worked with this company before and they gave me a really good deal. $380 for everything. The quartz, the sink, and the demo and install. That was in my budget. Changed everything out, and then I realized I probably should first focus on finishing the micro cement walls and tiling the floor before getting to the vanity. Mainly because I didn't want to put in all the work and have it ruined with splash marks from micro cement or mortar. The vanity could potentially get a little beat up, and I didn't want to do touch-ups. So a couple of months went by, and when those tasks were done, I got back to the vanity. The look I'm going for here is a Mexican Spanish vibe. I found this bathroom vanity inspo picture on Pinterest and fell in love with the reeded detail of the drawers. I kind of have a thing for reeded cabinets. 2 years ago, I redid my wet bar area and built something very similar. I still had leftover dowels from that project and figured I could use them for this vanity. I decided to start this transformation by cutting down the cabinet doors and converting them to inset doors. Inset cabinet doors basically means they sit flush with the face frame. I thought to myself, if I mess these up, I'm gonna have to build new doors, so might as well take the plunge. I did a dry fit, and from a distance it looked promising, but the smaller cabinet door, there's a shelf in the way which makes the door stick out a bit, so I decided to use my router to notch out the area where the shelf was hitting the cabinet door. When you use a router, just remember to start out low and slow. So in other words, don't remove a ton of material from the beginning. Set it up to where you're only removing a thin layer at a time until you get to the depth that you need. And yes, it is very easy to mess up if you don't have any practice. So remember, don't be too hard on yourself. Practice makes perfect when it comes to a router. After this, I moved on to the reeded detail for the drawer fronts. I removed the drawer front from the smaller drawer, and that was a task. I think it took me like 15 minutes to get it completely off. When I was finally able to remove it, I cut down both drawer fronts and did another dry fit to see how it was all going to come together. It looked really good. The drawer fronts were a little thicker than I wanted, but thankfully these drawer fronts are made of poplar, which means I can run them through the planer to make them flush to the face frame. After I ran them through the planer and got them to the thickness I wanted, I worked on cutting the half round pieces that will border the drawer front. I just attached them with wood glue and pin nails. Then I worked on cutting the dowels that will sit inside these borders. This is the best method I have found for cutting dowels the same length, using painter's tape. Take a handful of dowels, place them side by side, tape the tops and bottoms where you will be making your cut, and then you cut. I've said this before, I'm picky. I want my dowels to look as straight as possible and have found that cutting them side by side like this gives me the best results. Not perfect, but pretty good. Once I got all the dowels cut, I took off the painter's tape and noticed there was a little bit of tear out on the dowel ends, so I took a sanding block and sanded all the dowels, just the ends, to give them a smoother finish. Then I worked on gluing them down with wood glue. It seemed like a tedious task, but it's not too bad, and in my opinion, it's one of those DIYs that's worth it. And here's a tip. Dry fitting before gluing down is highly recommended because you don't want to end up with an uneven layout. These dowels are only 1/4 inch dowels, and if you don't plan it out right, you may end up with a gap on either side, but not a big enough gap to fill with the dowel. You know what I mean? The last thing I did is tape the edge where the dowels meet the half round and add a bead of caulk for a smoother transition. By filling the gap, you're saving yourself the trouble of having to dust between those grooves later on. Trust me. And it just makes it look more professional. And that's exactly what we're going for, a professional look. Once everything is caulked, take a wet cloth or a wipe to clean off the excess. Let it dry for a day or so, and the next day you can paint. Back to the cabinet doors. Since I am flipping them, and by flipping them I mean I'm literally flipping them around. So what used to be the inside will now sit on the outside and vice versa. That means there's big holes where the hinges used to be. I filled these holes with circles I cut out of scrap wood pieces with a hole saw. I glued them into place, and then I worked on removing these little anchors. I saw that there's a way you can remove them without having to cut anything, but honestly, since these anchors have been in for like 20 years, I just didn't even feel like dealing with it. So I took the multi-tool to it. Worked like a charm. And last but not least, I used my router with a flush trim bit to give the sides a nice clean look. It's been 11 years since I painted this vanity. I knew there was at least 4 layers of paint and poly on here. I saw one of my friends using this paint stripper on her furniture flips and decided to just give it a try. Oh my word, it's fantastic. Look how easy it removed 5 layers. 5. This stripper got down to the primer. It's such a good product. The next day I used Bondo to fill all the holes and then sanded all the doors. I did one last dry fit and I loved the way it looked. And now we paint. So here's the deal. This vanity is very well made, but it's not all real wood. So staining it is not really an option. But I also didn't want to just paint it. So instead, I decided to try this technique I've seen others do, where it's a faux wood finish, quote unquote. But again, I only want to use materials I already have. So I'm going to paint the cabinet using Dixie Belle Chalk mineral paint in the color Pinecone, and then add a Minwax gel stain over that to kind of give it the look of wood grain. To be honest, I wasn't even sure how this method was going to turn out, but I figured if I hated it, I could always paint over it. Here's what ended up happening. I don't know what it is about this gel stain. Supposedly it has a long open time. Yeah, that wasn't my case. It started drying pretty fast, and trying to get even streaks was so hard for me. I'm just not a staining type of girl. I wasn't really happy with how it looked and tried to fix a few spots, but only made it worse. So I just let it be. Also, it took more than 24 hours for that first coat to completely dry. It still felt tacky after 24 hours, so I had to let it sit for 48 hours before adding the second coat. Also, I messed up on a door and drilled on the wrong side, but I fixed it with Bondo. My son also came in at one point and picked up a door before it was fully dry, so I did have to do a few touch-ups. Overall though, I'm happy with the look, even though I probably won't be doing this again. I sealed everything with 2 coats of polyacrylic. Then I moved on to installing the drawer fronts. The fake drawer front still had the pieces that held it in place with screws, and since I never removed those pieces, I just reused them to attach the drawer front to the vanity. For the actual drawer, I used double-sided carpet tape to hold the drawer front in place and used playing cards to get even spacing around each drawer front. Then I screwed the drawer front into the drawer. Here's the only thing I spent money on for this project: soft close hinges. I actually bought 3 sets, but one set didn't have the right hinges in the bag, so I went back to Home Depot and found the right ones, and they let me have them for free. So shout out to Home Depot's customer service, because thanks to them, I only spent $25 on this project. I installed the hinges, but since these doors went from overlay to inset doors, I did have to add extra pieces of wood to make the sides flush with the face frame. It's cool, I have tons of scraps and was able to use them for this install. I also did have to notch out the shelf so the door would open and close correctly without rubbing. The last part, and my favorite part of flipping anything, is adding the hardware. I went with the Haley knobs from Plank Hardware because I wanted something subtle but pretty, and I wanted it in brass. I used a jig and my laser level to make sure the knobs lined up perfectly. I also placed tape at the top of each door so I could still open the vanity doors. Then I installed the knobs. And that's how we gave this 20-year-old vanity its glow up and left her looking real pretty. What a difference, right? I'm super happy that I didn't need to spend a ton of money and I was able to use materials I already had. Pretty proud of this project. You can see what used to be the outside of the vanity door is now the inside, and the soft close feature, love it. I hope this inspires you to get creative and give things a second chance rather than always purchasing new. As always, links are in the caption, and if you have any questions about this build, feel free to reach out and come hang out with me on Instagram. Happy DIYing!